Hello, my name is John Reynolds. On this episode of Extraordinary Life Stories, I'm talking with Professor Dan Nicolau. Dan is a mathematician, medical doctor, physician and engineer. He has 6 university degrees. He deliberately set out to educate himself and learn as much as possible about the natural world. I want to know why. We have not made much progress on curing cancer at all in the last century, and that's because we keep on trying to kill the cancers. Dan's work focuses on trying to diffuse it, like we do with organised crime. I've never heard of cancer being compared to the mafia. His groundbreaking work focuses on cancer is not your enemy. Hey? That's quite a statement, considering half of us will get cancer and a third will die of it, and he knows this. It's literally the why behind all his efforts to find a cure to prevent these very stats. Dan flew back from Harvard yesterday to film this interview with me, where his groundbreaking clinical trials are taking place. Let's get into it. I'm really looking forward to talking with Dan. Dan, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Cool. Tell me, who is Professor Dan Nicolau?
So Dan to my friends, I think like everybody else, a work in progress, an evolving person, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, with stages and setbacks and stuff.
It's a very humble way of answering that.
It's
let me take you back to a young Dan growing up. What did you want to be when you were aspiring to grow up?
So my parents are scientists, both of them, chemists, and so I grew up with loads of science. And I don't really remember a time that I didn't want to be either a scientist or a doctor or an engineer. I ended up becoming all three through restlessness, essentially. But yeah, a lot of it is family influence. I think when I was little, it was something like be an astronaut, like a lot of kids, and then that sort of evolved into mathematics, basically, and that evolved into engineering, and then that sort of evolved into like whether the human body is sort of an engineering system, and that evolved into clinical medicine, and now there's a kind of a combination of those things in my research career. Broadly.
But having all that education in that space and then joining dots in that space makes you pretty formidable, in terms of what you do now.
Yeah, so I think people used to do it in the Renaissance. We talk about Renaissance man or Renaissance person. It was possible because there was less knowledge to be had. Yeah. So you could be, a person of state and a scientist and a physician. It became harder because we got so much knowledge and it became very self-specialized. So although it seems like what I've done, 6th degree, it sounds crazy, but there's a little bit of method to the madness, just a little. And it's about, could you recreate a Renaissance person in the 21st century? Because we do have a lot more tools at our disposal for learning. Sure. So the answer, I think, I can say now after 20 years is yes. You can be an engineer, a doctor, and a mathematician. It's a lot of focused, intense study, basically, but not requiring any special skills, just intense study.
You've got 6 degrees.
Yeah.
And also, I love the fact you researched nature extensively, didn't you? And what was the why behind that?
Yeah, that's a good question. The ancients used to think about, when it comes to the body, for example, as being integrative. So, theory of humors and stuff, that things have to be in balance. We kind of lost that in the Enlightenment. We started thinking about how to take things apart, as though God was an engineer. So now we take flowers apart, we take cells apart, we take, the brain apart, try to break everything down to its constituent parts, the reductionist approach, in the hope that we can then put everything back together. But I was going through my undergraduate years and I didn't really feel that. I felt like something was kind of lost and that we are somehow more than the sum of the parts. So I wanted to have a career that integrated everything together in the hope and belief that at some point in the 21st century, we will once again begin to think about the body and therefore disease and health as a whole, as an integrative effort, basically.
Yeah, I get that. And the conversation we've had prior to filming that I particularly enjoyed, particularly because as someone of your level of intellect, you don't use complicated jargon. You seem to know that whether it's talking to me or anyone that you're trying to relay what you're doing, you talk in layman's terms, you talk in almost visualization. And of course, this understanding of nature and understanding what potentially hasn't worked before and I'm going to use the term that you've used to me, cancer is not your enemy. That would shock quite a few people. It kills so many people. You'll have all the stats. Talk to me about how the sort of journey you've come from and how you've come into this to then be able to reframe that and what you're actually doing.
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. It partially came out of after my PhD, which was here at Oxford. I went to UC Berkeley, and I worked in the lab of a great lady called Mimi Cole, who, amongst many other accomplishments, was studying the emergence of multicellularity. So we start, obviously life used to be unicellular. At some point, we became multicellular, things like jellyfish, and then developed into what we are: whales, elephants, right? Yeah. The cost of that is cancer, right? Because you can't have cancer as a single-celled organism. So when you become a community, you can get things like organized crime, for example, within the community. We've never really thought about cancer that way, but my thought when I was at Berkeley and studying this stuff is, if cancer is really, it's not a foreign invader, they are our cells. They are as close to us as, it's more like a family feud, partially why we have so much trouble treating it, because the cells are almost identical to the normal cells, right? If you think about how you treat disease, usually it's because of the difference between, say, bacteria and us. That's how you use antibiotics. In cancer, that doesn't really work because there are cells. So we do things like chemotherapy, which is like carpet bombing. Essentially, you hope to kill the tumor before you kill the patient. And we haven't really made a lot of progress on that. And I think it's because we're using the wrong metaphor. We think of it as a foreign enemy or a foreign invader. Yeah. But it's part of us. It's more like a family feud that blows up out of control. Yeah. Or like a little tiny gang of pretty benign, kids doing graffiti in the McDonald's parking lot that turns into like a civil war.
I was going to say, because ultimately anyone watching or listening to this would be like, if you sort of relate it to a little gang, it's doing a lot of damage. It's taking a lot of lives. They're a very effective little gang. So using that same language and metaphor, how are you working from a preventative point of view and a cure point of view to actually sort the gang out?
Yeah. Another great question. So I think if you think about how organized crime takes hold in society, it's because people don't have welfare, don't have safety, don't have jobs, don't have running water, right? And the way that societies that are successful at fighting organized crime fight it, it's not usually that much through policing or punitive measures in jail. What eventually brings the gangs down is welfare, safety, jobs, a meaningful, purposeful life that the state can and society can help to provide. So the counterpart to that in cancer therapy would be, there are a lot of things, but for example, something that we're working on at the moment is a grant to implant little chips inside tumors and see if they have electrical activity, kind of like a little brain, what we've been calling protocognition. So as the cancer grows, it probably has a basic form of cognition, not like we have, but trying to represent its world, our interior, and trying to survive. It doesn't want to kill you because it dies with you. So in that respect, it's not an enemy. So one thing we can do is just try to listen to the signals it's sending internally, see if it has like a very basic language, see if we can kind of talk back a little bit. That's kind of sci-fi stuff.
Sure.
That's one thing. Something else that we learned in the pandemic, for example, from COVID, is that a lot of the damage that it does and a lot of the deaths that it causes are through the immune system over-responding. And if you use things that calm down the immune system, paradoxically, you may be able to prevent most COVID hospitalizations or deaths simply by just chilling out, if I can use that expression, the immune system. So the hope is that will work with cancer as well, and indeed many other diseases.
Yeah, so actually through obviously a very difficult situation, the pandemic, some of the learnings from that are actually helping everything you're doing into the cancer side of things.
Oh yes, we learned an enormous amount. Immunology learned an enormous amount about, very unfortunate circumstances, of course, but we learned, we probably did 20 years of immunology in a couple of years in the pandemic. Yeah. And we are beginning to see things differently now, including this interaction between, for example, the brain and the immune system.
Yes.
People with a positive mindset do better at infections, do better at cancer, and conversely, the immune response affects the brain. So we're now beginning to really kind of get to understanding that interaction. And it has to be the future because we know that the mind and the body affect each other deeply, profoundly.
Yes, there's a lot more being talked about, which is a good thing. I'd love to relate that to you, actually. All the Harvard, you've kindly flown from Harvard yesterday to come back and film with me today. There's the time, the effort, the juggling that goes with that. What do you do with all that you know and understand to do with mindset and to do with the physical health side of things? What do you do to keep yourself both mentally fit and physically fit?
Yeah, it's hard after flight.
Yeah.
So, I mean, honestly, a lot of it is I just get a huge amount of excitement and energy from interacting with my students, past and present. And
Yeah.
in some respects, if someone were to ask me what I look forward to, after I get off my jet lag, well, I have some medical students. They're a delight. I'm going to probably teach them a little bit next week. Some of my past students are doing very well now. So a lot of it is just about, I'm lucky enough that in my work, I get to interact with really amazing people,
Yeah.
most of them very modest, most of them unsung heroes.
Yes.
So that helps a lot. And then the rest of it, I mean, I'm interested to hear what you do, but, a little bit of meditation, like jogging, nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual, the usual stuff, get some sleep.
Yeah, sure. And what about diet?
Yeah. One thing I would say that hasn't been appreciated enough, maybe until recently, is the importance of the gut and the lung, which also has a biome, on homeostasis, basically, which is how the body keeps you centered. So taking care of the intestinal flora. I think if you ask most people what percentage of the immune system was in the stomach, I mean, the stomach is like, 5% of you or something?
Yeah.
Or the intestine, is 10%. How much of the immune system is there? It's like 75 or 80%.
Yeah.
So the great majority of our immunity is connected, for reasons that we don't understand, to our gut, and some of it to our lung. So taking care of the community down there. As you age, that community is under assault from various, bad food, stress, life. So it's important to protect that. And you can do things. You can drink kefir.
I was going to ask you for an example. Like maybe is there a certain kind of supplement or part of your diet that you really prioritize for that very reason?
I religiously drink kefir, and I grew up in Romania. It's in the culture. We just, not because it's good for your gut biome. It's just so drinking milk. It's just something that we do. And other cultures have other ways. So I don't think it matters exactly how you do it, but kefir, and just make sure that you basically the food that we eat in the West is pretty terrible. We know it causes a lot of inflammation, and inflammation is almost, by definition, a disease state. I mean, it's not just an academic thing that we measure in the lab. Inflammation is almost exactly what you mean when you say you aren't feeling well.
Yeah.
And so we know after like low quality food, you get the inflammatory spikes. If you don't sleep enough because you're looking at social media late at night, you get inflammatory signals up. So basically, to some extent, reducing inflammation is really the goal.
Yes.
It seems now in 2023 that's what we'll learn over the next 10, 20 years, that just reducing inflammation. Animals that have very low inflammation live far longer than their counterparts that aren't as good at fighting inflammation.
That's interesting.
Yeah, there are some rats in Kenya who live, none of them get cancer ever. They don't get Alzheimer's, they don't get heart disease. They're called the naked mole rat. And it seems like what they're doing is they're just really good at not getting inflamed.
Yeah.
And they live like 10 or 20 times longer than their
nature.
counterparts. Yeah, nature's been at this for 3.5 billion years. We're just...
Why the naked mole rat? But
I don't know why it's got to be the naked mole rat, but nature's been at this for 3.5 billion years, so it's going to be like 1,000 times smarter than us. Yeah. So we should just be learning from nature.
Totally. You mentioned inflammation. We're interested to know how much of that is affected physically and whether it can actually be affected mentally.
It could absolutely be affected mentally. There are some classic experiments, not even recent, from the 70s, where you can behaviorally condition it in rats. For example, you give them an immune suppressant and sugar water. Then you take away the immune suppressant, you give them sugar water, they get inflammation. Some of the animals die. There's an experiment where they got actors to act sad scenes and happy scenes from Shakespeare, and the ones who acted the sad scenes were immune suppressed afterwards and less able to fight infections. It's not even real sadness because it's an act.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the irony.
Yeah, ironically, yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's a lot of evidence now emerging around this stuff, really fascinating stuff, some of it that we are working on, but it's a big effort. So inflammation can be caused by the brain and can be also tapered down by the brain. There's evidence that social media causes inflammatory markers to go up. We're not really sure how, possibly by interfering with self-esteem or other things. And there's also evidence in the other direction that if you have a high level of inflammation, you seek out social media. which will probably make your inflammation worse. It's probably a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
So, and in respect of the care of children, that's clearly something that legislatively and policy-wise needs to be thought about as this evidence continues to emerge.
Yeah.
You know, so no, but to answer your question as succinctly as I know how, absolutely, your brain can control your inflammatory state, and your inflammatory state affects your brain and your mind, and the two have been in this dance for hundreds of millions of years, trying to keep you safe. So yes, absolutely.
But social media has not been around for hundreds of times, and so we're all consumed by it now. It's not going away. And so as a parent of two daughters, you've got your son. How are we going to manage that? That's not a fair question to Professor. It's more of a joint question, but that's something we really need to be aware of.
I'm keen to hear your thoughts, but what I can say is that in the late 1800s, this debate was being had about privacy. It wasn't recognized as a human right or as a legislative right. It wasn't recognized as any kind of right. And the newspapers were really, really violating upon the family circle and privacy of the individual. And a couple of, at Harvard actually, a couple of guys published what is now a very famous article in the Harvard Law Review called The Right to Privacy, arguing that violating upon privacy is causing harm, and that privacy is a human right, or it's a right in tort law, or a statutory right, and it needs to be protected under law. We would now not conceive of living in a community or a society that doesn't protect the right to privacy. It's the United Nations Article 12. It's in the Constitution of this country. It's in the Constitution of the United States, and basically anywhere that we would live. And yet we have nothing for attention, even though social media is assaulting it all the time. And I think it's, you know, if you think about what will seem barbaric in a couple of decades, it probably will be that it's taken us so long to get to protecting it as a right, as a legal right, potentially a human right.
God, the challenge with that, and you actually asked me that, is, you know, as a parent that will go on social media, so your kids see that, and I know how addictive it can be. There's a For You page on Instagram. It's got all the things you love, and click one more. So actually, there's a hypocrisy in probably all the families around the world where, you know, you've got your kids consumed by it. It's clearly bad for them, and then we're doing it well. We're doing it as well. That's now become a habit. It's become a culture.
Maybe one way for you to think about it as a parent is smoking. So we know smoking is bad for you. We know it causes lung cancer. Right?
Sure.
We've known that for a really long time. So we do let people smoke, but we try to regulate it. We don't let children smoke. And it took a long time for society to kind of go, hey, you know what, actually, clearly it's causing lung cancer and heart problems and loads of other things. But eventually the law did catch up and continues to evolve. So
I never thought of relating it, but that's why I love the way your brain works. You have this whole way of relating it and reframing it. But that's pretty controversial, because actually I know that friends around us, the sort of generation ahead of, if you like, that, you know, when Facebook, Instagram was coming out and they were letting their kids have it, they were doing an account for their dog, and then those kids got really heavily bullied because of all the, you know, the kind of cyberbullying, if you like, and lessons were learned. But that's a different way of what we're talking about to actually the whole inflammation. It's actually causing physical problems. That's a whole different thing, because that was more of a societal thing.
I see what you mean, yes.
Do you know what I mean? So
there was a distinction, yes, of course.
Yeah, right? I mean, of course, people were saying it can't be good for your brain and so on, but then there were people saying, but people said you shouldn't watch too much TV.
Yeah.
People said you shouldn't, and so, but this is actually...
I mean, smoking causes inflammation, drugs cause inflammation, life causes essentially inflammation. Yeah. But when it comes to social media, if you can show, and it is still being, you know, worked on, but if you can show inflammation is harm. When we talk about feeling sick, feeling unwell, like before an infection or in a high period of stress, you know, through some, you know, personal tragedy or something like that, what we are describing is inflammation. It's not just associated. When you're feeling unwell, what you are describing is that you have high inflammatory markers. So if social media is causing inflammatory markers at levels comparable to cancer, to heart disease, or to diabetes, or to mental health problems, then it is harming you physically, literally, not metaphorically. It is causing your body to be harmed and basically pushed closer to death.
It's pretty scary.
So it's not like a theoretical construct. If that turns out to be the case, or to the degree to which it turns out to be the case, and if it exacerbates it because you have inflammation, you seek out social media, which is making it worse, then I think it's, you know, society will demand that legislation.
And they need to. I mean, you've got no choice. And what's interesting is this isn't a conversation in the pub with someone that isn't, you know, informed. You're a professor, you're a doctor, you're around all this stuff. So that's what really hits home for me, is as you say, it's not proven yet, but as far as you're concerned, if you were asked, is it absolutely a direct correlation? 100%. That is pretty scary.
I think it would take a lot of imagination to argue that it's not the case.
Scary times.
Yeah.
Your eyes lit up when you talked about your students, and that there's a sense of camaraderie and connectivity there, which is also a mental thing. I think I've been learning a lot more about how important connectivity is and so on, rather than being on your own and not communicating and not learning. Do you really enjoy that nurturing side of things and that sense of community where you're all learning off each other? And did you get brought up around that?
Yeah, I mean, I really do. A lot of the time in universities, people sort of think about teaching as kind of a nuisance because it takes you away from research, takes you away from more the posher things that promote a career. But my dad, who's a professor, has this analogy that teaching and research are like the hull and the mast of a ship. Mm-hmm. You want to put all the sails up because you go faster. That's research. But if you don't have a deep hull, the boat capsizes or is dysfunctional.
Got to be in harnessing and in tandem.
You need both. You need a balance. Yeah. So the teaching, I find it. I mean, it's I live for it, for the interactions, and to some extent, it's a selfish sentiment, right? Because I get to feel like I'm helping. So I mean, I'm no saint, But yeah, I think that really helps to propel you. At the end of the day, all the papers and all the research and stuff, of course it's very important for humanity, but it's it's hard to, it's not going to keep you warm at night essentially. But the interactions with colleagues, with students, with the public actually.
Yeah.
When I was in Australia, I was doing some stuff with high schools, teaching about science, careers and stuff, and that's amazing. Yeah. And like you, I'm a dad, so having to teach my 3-year-old, why is the sky blue? It's that's a very good question. Yeah. And so that kind of, obviously that provides a lot of energy too. Yeah.
And actually, just in context of talking to you now, listening to that, there's an element of success around what you're doing and what can happen with some of these trials and so on. But along the way, none more so probably than in your profession, to achieve any success, you have to fail, like regularly.
Yeah.
And I think whether that's from a business mindset, from an athlete's point of view, a lot of people have this fear of failure. You clearly can't have that in context of what you do, because you've got to keep trying different things to eliminate, which actually they become obstacles rather than failure to seek the success. Is that a mindset you've always had because of how you've been a doctor, a professor, and in that space?
It's very wise of you to put it that way, and I think that's probably wiser than most scientists would put it, that it's kind of our job to fail. Yeah. The best you can do to try to figure out how nature works is to try things that don't work, to try something else. You're sort of partitioning this gesture that you made with your hands. You partition the space, carve out the bits that don't work. So it's kind of our job to fail, which is reassuring, because if you fail, you're like, literally, I'm doing my job. Yeah.
And you're narrowing
towards a theory of how it actually works. Unfortunately, we are human. I mean, not unfortunately, but being what we are, it's hard to sustain, failing all the time. And the way grants work and the way research progress in practice works, and promotions and stuff, is you need some successes. Because we don't promote people who fail all the time, even though everybody understands that that's how science is supposed to work. So you need to find sort of a balance. But typically, people don't report their failures because it doesn't sound very good. No. But it's actually those that are teaching you most about nature. And medicine and engineering and so on. In respect of whether it's something that I feel like I am a little bit more comfortable with it than some of my colleagues. I don't really know where I sit. I don't particularly see it as a bad thing if I try something, and I've tried loads of stuff that hasn't worked. So
and it might be slightly different in your personal life because the human element comes into it, and that's where we have to override that mindset. Whereas when you're in the trenches, in the professor mindset, is this going to work? Boom, didn't work. It's out of your mind. There's no emotion. Didn't work. Why didn't it work? Well, personally, it might be slightly different.
So of course, personally, it's different, but even professionally, you become quite attached to your theory. I mean, people lose sleep over it. I lose sleep over it.
Yeah, sure.
This cancer thing that we're talking about, this grant that I'm putting in with some colleagues from here and from Europe, there's a lot of emotional energy that's gone into this.
Reputational side of things as well?
To some extent. Yeah, of course.
Creates
Of course, particularly as you get to sort of like the middle of your career where you can't quite it's harder to fail because you sort of have more responsibility.
Yeah,
and
I
stuff.
get that.
And you're
I'm
not
a dad now, and all,
there are things.
Yeah.
So no, people become very attached, and you'd be surprised some of the feuds in science between scientists of competing theories, and a lot of it's emotional.
Okay.
Because they should be, whatever the truth is, they should be totally chilled out about it, but that's not really what happens. So people become very, very attached to their ideas, and indeed, I think it's necessary to do that in order to sustain yourself, because it's a hard career.
Yeah.
Especially if it's medical research. So if you're a doctor and a scientist, it's the only way you could sustain that level of energy and effort for decades on end is by being emotionally involved, much as personally.
Yeah.
So to some extent, it's kind of reassuring that people love their theories.
No, I get that.
But at the same time, love,
the
is a double-edged
attachment,
sword.
the behaviour that comes afterwards. And I think one thing that I feel sets you apart, and very much is your mindset and your approach to literally what you're doing with the approach to curing cancer. You touched on the whole organised crime, make them feel part of the community and so on. Every form of preventative and cure has been to attack.
Yeah.
And chemo, of course, you get carpet bombing and everything's attack.
Yeah.
And yet, where did that mindset come from to actually look to nurture? Because you've related that to community. So that's kind of almost a human element. But from a scientist's point of view, I guess everyone's looked to, we need to eliminate, we need to carpet bomb.
Yeah.
How did that come in? Was there where was the sort of thought process that came through that you then linked that to cancer?
So I'm not a historian of science. My understanding is that basically around about the time that we started to understand about genes and genetic makeup and stuff is really when people started thinking of it. Possibly it's a viewpoint coming from the military, where a lot of the research was done around about the time of both world wars, and people started thinking that when we talk about cancer treatments, we almost always talk about targets. People say, I found a new target, and we're going to start a new startup company that's going to target that cell or whatever. And there's certainly a role for that, and we have made progress in cancers, for example, in pediatric cancers a lot. But overall, it doesn't seem like it's the right metaphor, and that we really should be thinking of it as something that has kind of gone wrong in how the cells are supposed to cooperate and work together. Yeah. And a few of them feel like they need to go off and attack. And the more that the immune system attacks and then the oncologist attacks, the more cornered, it's a vicious circle. The more cornered they feel, the more it escalates, and at the end, the result is metastatic disease and death. So there's certainly room for some new ideas. What we are doing, for example, we're calling it oncoespionage. I want to put a little chip in your tumor and just listen to what they're saying. A lot of the way we win wars, including against the mafia, is through espionage rather than guns. Yeah,
infiltrate, understand, get the intel,
do something. Block their comms.
But that hasn't been done in any way really until you understood that mindset and went in, because everything
as far as I know, we're
the
first.
Yeah. That's groundbreaking. It's awesome.
We'll see how it.
Humbling to be talking to you on that basis, because it's a huge killer. Anyone watching this or listening to it is likely to know someone or have been around someone that it's taken lives from. So if you can in any way, eliminate the killer, that's going to be
start to think of it. I mean, there's a colleague of mine who said this, so I'm borrowing a line, but instead of thinking sort of what we do with organized crime, we can't completely eliminate it, right? We'll never eliminate crime from society, but we turn it into a low-grade chronic problem. We turn it into something that, we interact with sometimes. We kind of do a bit of prevention, a bit of policing, a bit of kind of, removing the incentives to defecting from society and becoming a criminal. We do all of those things, and that's how we kind of keep crime from dominating society and, destroying communities, right? And so the hope is that that's what we'll be able to eventually do with cancer. It will never go away because it's the price of multicellularity. It's the price of the rich lives that we have where we're sitting here having an interview with, cameras and computers and stuff. The cost is that when you have a society and a community, things sometimes do go wrong. Sure. But the hope is that we can turn it into something that we can live with. It will not kill us. We can coexist with in some form. Yeah.
Oh, I love it. At the heart of this as well, and sort of at the beginning of all this, is education. Now, if there's anyone watching, listening to this that knows what you're doing, aspires to want to make a difference, what advice would you give them starting out? So let's just say they're coming through maybe teenage years. What advice would you give them? Because you've got perspective now. You're looking back, you can see where you've made a difference, where some of the people that you are working with make a difference, and you can give some advice potentially early in the career. Because there's so many things you don't learn in school that you are learning now that are not part of the academic curriculum.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm qualified to give it.
I'm not asking you from a qualification. I'm asking you from a Dan's point of view. You're a dad now. Of course, your son's going to learn
Yeah,
through just being around you. But you know what I mean by that. My question's aimed at the fact that algebra, the Bunsen burner,
yeah.
the classic kind of cliche upbringing. There's so much more to be able to open up people's eyes to how they could potentially make a difference. Of course, to go
Yes.
the professor route, it's qualifications and so on. But there's other people that may not choose to go that way, may not be intelligent enough, but just all being able to make a difference.
I'm sure that they're intelligent enough. I mean, intelligence is not the barrier to becoming a scientist. Yeah, no. So now that I understand your question a little better, there's a lot of pressure to commit early in your career, right? So so I did mathematics for my undergrad, and then people are like, okay, so you need to become a mathematician. And I was like, let's do some engineering first, and people always trying to like kind of channel you into growing up quickly and stuff, and there are a lot of avenues now. You can join a startup, you can work in biotech firms, you can stay in universities, you can do I've done all of the above, and it seems not to have harmed me. So I think just staying curious and not letting the voices around you, that including your parents, who just want you to have a nice stable life, of course they've got your back.
Not always the best advice, though, is it?
Like generals, they're always fighting the last war.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think, my one piece of advice from Dan would be to just stay, that's what I say to all my students, just stay curious. Don't think, you've got time, think about what you want to do, really find your passion. Because if you don't find it, and most people don't, it's very hard to sustain a happy, what the Greeks called eudaimonia, like a purposeful, meaningful life, happiness through purpose. It's very difficult to do that if you're not passionate about what you're doing.
Yeah.
So that means the corollary of that is that as long as it takes to find your passion, that's however long that takes, that's the time,
That's brilliant. Yeah, I get that. And the passion is absolutely evident with you. And of course, what a legacy, what a achievement that would be. And I'm interested to know that, is there an achievement that you're particularly proud of at this stage of your life, and how important is legacy to you?
I mean, I think legacy is almost everything. I struggle to think of any degree of success that doesn't involve legacy. I think I've learned, possibly starting from quite low level, to have more compassion and more love, basically. I've come to think what we need for most of the world's problems, including medical problems, is more love, more understanding. I've gotten better at that. It's a work in progress, I can assure you. But if there is an accomplishment, it's that I've become less judgmental and able, to some extent, to be more compassionate. And I look forward to the rest of the journey and to imparting that, for example, on my son, but also, of course, on my students. That if there's one thing I would say, it's learning, to try to be more loving,
That's great.
More compassionate.
And in context of these trials in Harvard, there's an impatient part to me in anything I'm doing. So I'm listening to you thinking this is all incredibly potentially groundbreaking, exciting. Is there any kind of timeline on this? I mean, I used that example of failure, narrowing it down, but do you have any kind of idea or I don't want to use the word targets because of what you said, but in terms of goals, is there a moment where you'll start to think, gosh, this is actually looking like it's absolutely going to be working, and so on, and how long might that take?
So the cycle in medical research is long because we have to balance safety with innovation. And, if you think about things like thalidomide, for example, we would obviously never want anything like that to happen ever again. No. So there's a balance. You have to try to go as fast as you can, but it also has to be balanced with so you start in mice, then you move on to, eventually do it in humans. It isn't quick. But the good news is that it's getting quicker. Things like AI, a lot of the biotech techniques and lab techniques we have now are making things go a lot faster. I would be disappointed if in half a decade to a decade from now we don't have some solid evidence that we can deal with a large body of tumors, a diverse body of tumors, by using some of these ideas about listening. Is there a basic language? Can we interfere with their communications? Can we remove some of the incentives for being invasive or being aggressive? Can we do something other than carpet bomb, incessantly? I would be disappointed if in 5 years from now there isn't, a concrete thing there, and if in 10 years from now it's not, being used widely in the clinic, so
it's not wrong, right?
Which is
on the basis of the last, say, 100 years and how much
yes,
we've improved and saved people's lives, it's nothing. So that's actually really encouraging. That's exciting.
I'm glad to hear you say that. So I thought you might be disappointed by it.
I have read. Well, from an impatient point of view, there's people that could be watching this now, and that's the sad thing. They need it now. But as long as it's coming, as long as it's pointing in the right direction, and you're clearly, I feel guilty taking your time and sitting with you talking now, because it's just amazing what you're doing. But
there's a huge amount of work going into cancer worldwide with massive amounts of funding. We're very good at it here in Britain. They're very good in the US. There are other places around the world. And I think we can hope that within this century, next 20, 30 years, that it'll be cured in between inverted commas. I mean, we'll never completely get rid of it because, like the community, things will always go wrong.
Yeah.
But that we'll be able to approach a level where we start to think of it sort of how we think about diabetes now, like something you have to live with and something that you might die with, but not of.
I get that. Managing it.
Yeah, just something manageable. I think that's the hope for the next 20, 30 years within our careers. Yeah.
I've learned so much talking to you.
Likewise.
I've been so looking forward to it, and you flew in especially. You're an extraordinary person. So thank you so much for coming to talk to me. I really appreciate it.
The pleasure was mine, I'm sure.
Cheers. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you.